Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Welcome back to Excel Super User Program. Today we are on day 8. Again, if you want to watch this video, you can watch this in my iSelf Academy snippet channel and then Excel snippet channel if you wanted to. This will be named as Excel User Series 6.0. Again, I didn't name the playlist as English edition, but I've named the Tamil edition separately. So if you want to watch this in either the English language or in Tamil language, whichever one which you feel is better, you can do that. As I promised yesterday, I will be adding these files for you at the end of our session. So where we will see this week, we will be having both the dimensions of the data coming up for us, where we will start with the first 5-day classes with one mail for all of you, plus the next 5-day classes will be added to the other mail. One more information that I want to pass on today, that is tomorrow we may not be having our session. So if you are looking for our videos on the YouTube channel, probably you may not be getting that on Friday morning, but on Saturday we will be getting the Friday classes, and then on Saturday I'll create the Thursday sessions or the mode up session on Saturday. Probably on Sunday morning you'll be getting the next list. Without further ado, let's start our session. And then today it's the most beautiful day because we are able to start the most used Excel ribbon function ever, or this is going to become, or the USB of Excel generally comes with two different logics, and one of them is the one which we are going to learn today. It's called a pivot table. Today in our session we'll be talking about pivot table, chart and slices. If you want to know what is a slicer, probably you can just go back to the yesterday's video I have uploaded just now for all of you, so you can you can use that. I didn't upload it just now, I did last night, but I have allowed it to I scheduled it for today morning. So you'll be getting all these dimensions, and let's learn what is a pivot table is all about. So when I go for a pivot table, again I'm using this pivot table option a little differently here. Again, when I go for pivot table, normally I break them into 3 different parts of it: pivot table, pivot chart and slices. When I go for pivot table, I can just make it with a much more lighter portion. Normally when I want to just give a jargonized terminology for a pivot table, I'll call that as calculation of criteria. And if that happens for my pivot chart, I'll call it as a pictorial representation of the calculated criteria here. And we also call this as VIS, a visualization of our pivot table in a much more detailed pattern. And we already know about slicer a bit, so it is a fancy filter. So let's go into pivot table. Why I am taking this presentation for us is I want you to understand how pivot table works and what a pivot table's specialty is all about. And I'm giving at the basic level today. I'm not going to go too deep into it. If time permits, I definitely go for our next logic also, which is an interactive dashboard that I'm about to create using a pivot table. Again, now dashboard creation is becoming so viral because they're using a lot of tools to make it. I'm going to create a simple dashboard. I'm not going to make our dashboard too complicated. I'm going to make it as simple as possible, as light as possible. The only thing that I'm about to do right now is I'm going to make some color changes. How I can quickly create a interactive dashboard. Normally if you create one by one, that's going to take a solid 45 minutes to an hour in a earlier version of it. Now people say they do it in 10 minutes, 2 minutes using AI functionalities. Yes, you may have the facility to do so, but again you have to have the complete understanding of pivot table better. But my pivot table is not going to be done in 2 or 3 minutes like other promises. I will do it in under 15 minutes time, and I'm going to make sure that the pivot table looks spick and span. Again, I'm not doing too much of colorings or too much of background colors and other dimensions. I'm making the pivot table look more like a pivot table created in an Excel sheet, not in any other visualization tools that we have in market. So when I go for pivot table, what is a pivot table? So how a pivot table will look like? So normally the pivot table will look like this. Again, I've created this particular data set for a service provider called Gooby. Again, it was earlier a part of IIT Madras. Now it is taken over by HCL. So if you you can get, they are giving some different products for you, and if you want you can just use this. Again, this is how the pivot table will look like. You will see a pivot table in any one of the dimensions that we have here. So when I go for pivot table, what is a pivot table? If you're working on this pivot table, I will always say that pivot table can be called in any one of the dimensions. If you want to just give a mouthful of information to others, then you can say I can create a report using a calculation with a condition and criteria, blah blah blah. If you are using, or if you want to just say that as a powerful word here, then I can say I can summarize the data using pivot table, or whatever I used a while ago called calculation with criteria can also be used. So normally when I say pivot table, it summarizes all my raw data into a readable or effective data sets for me. When I go for pivot table, many people will say that, you know, when you do pivot table comes beautifully. When I do it, it is not coming up. Why in the world it's happening like that? I follow this golden rule to make sure that my pivot table works for me properly. So I keep 3 component. Header is must, so I cannot leave any column of my data without a heading. So heading is very, very important for me. Next part is I need to have a proper data set. That means I should avoid blank cells, rows or column. In some situation, we will be having a data with such a scenario. Wherever we may not have, or we don't have a value, you can leave it blank. Wherever you cannot fill a data or make sure the data has to be filled in there. The third part will come into play. If I have a blank cell and row, and if I want to fill them all with some data or the other, I can either delete if I don't want that entire row or a column or a cell if I'm not going to use it. If it is a partially blanked or partially no value available, then wherever I want to fill in and 0 there, I can add it. Again, in some situation we may not able to neither delete it nor add a 0 to it. So that's going to be a real challenge for us. So if that is the case, then what you will do? So how do you work on it? So we will be seeing that too. So when I go back to the next list, again, what version you are using in Excel, I'm not sure about it. So I've just gone back to 2003 version, my most loved version in Excel. Again, as a trainer, I cannot really stick to one particular version forever. So I have to really move on to the next version. So now I am jumped, or I am literally placed in Office 365, so which gets the updates pretty regularly for me. Again, mostly the keyboard shortcut that we use in creating a pivot table will be Alt NVT. So if the very old version that comes in play, you can use Alt DP. If you are not using the older version, you're using something in between, maybe because now as of I believe that anybody and everybody has 2013 version with them. It was a year ago I said 2010 was the version that you minimum have. Now we have 2016, 13 versions are available. So if you're doing a pivot table there, then the keyboard shortcut will change for you. It will become Alt NV. You will get the pivot table. You want to hit Alt NVT. So we'll see how we're going to use this keyboard shortcut. Generally I don't use keyboard shortcut. I'll go back to pivot table in the insert tab and then click them all. Again, we'll see pivot table a little extensively because probably in our next 3 classes we will be talking pivot table only, because I have another bigger version of pivot table to see it. I want to give a kickstart today, so I am starting with a simple logic today. When I go for pivot table, like we saw our anatomy of Excel, I even wanted to show you the pivot table anatomy for us, because pivot table anatomy really make our life a little better, because we understand how a pivot table gives you the options for you, and then what you can do with it and what you cannot do with it. So we can just see them all, and we have a better options coming in our latest version. Again, people are looking beyond pivot table nowadays. You no longer see pivot table used effectively, because pivot table has its own slight variant. When you are adding a larger data, if you're adding a lot of pivot table, then pivot table will have its own challenges here. Again, still the go-to functionality for data analytics, I preferably use pivot table, but I'll use with the powerful combination of Power Query and Power Pivot, so that my data accumulation is not going to be a process every time when I create a pivot table. Instead, I keep a dynamic data running through, and then that way I will make sure the pivot table works spick and span for me without recreating them every now and then. So when I go for pivot table anatomy, the pivot table anatomy gives you, according to me, I take three different logics in place here. The first part is pivot cache. That is the first option that I have in here. You can see that this is the pivot cache that I have here. You can see that this will automatically populate when we click or when we add a pivot table to it. This is where our pivot table will also sit and all your data sets will be added automatically. The next logic is going to be on the next part is called pivot table fields here. So the moment pivot table cache comes on the left hand side, on the right hand side, whatever data that you use, that data will be populated here in the table for you, and then it'll ask you for what do you want to do with it. So I will be using this data for our interactive dashboard a little later. I'm going to build some random data right now so that I'll show a lighter version of pivot table. When I come back to pivot table field, I would love to explain this particular window a little better, because at the bottom of your screen you will see 4 boxes coming up here, and on top you will see there is a search option available for you in the choosing the column to add in your report, or you can just check the box in it. When you check the box, your data will be defined in 2 different dimensions. The first one is called measures, wherever we have a number field like sales, profit, COGS or purchase value. They are all called as number field. So when you check the last 3 boxes, that's going to automatically populate into your value field. And if you're picking up anything like a date or a city or a sales rep or customer, it will be called as dimension. That will jump into the row for you automatically. The filter and the column field will never be filled by giving a check boxes on top. That's going to be, you can see that above the filter and column, you'll see drag field between the areas below. That is given for all the 4 boxes. But for the filter and the column, the checkbox will not really populate the data in the filters and columns, and then columns and filters has to be dragged and dropped so that you will get the report according to your list here. So there will be a subtle variant when we are working on the pivot table fields here. So I'm going to just go back to this data. Let's see what is the next data that we are going to see. And again, this is where the next floating window will come into play. When I come back to the floating window will give you 2 new dimensions. Again, this will showcase only when your cursor is in your pivot cache. If your cursor is outside the pivot cache in some other Excel cell references, then these 2 pivot table analysis and design won't be appearing for you. In pivot table analysis, the most used logic will be, if I have a data, I don't know what pivot table that I have to create right now, then I will use a recommended pivot table for you. And I can also create a pivot chart. I can create a new calculated field in pivot table if I wanted to, or I can clear the selections, or you can clear the pivot table or move the pivot table to a different sheet. I can change the data sources, I can refresh the data, I can add a slicer, and I can also add a timeline wherever I have a date involved in my pivot table. I can do them all here. So that's what a pivot table analysis will be used a lot, and I preferably use that as a list here. When I go for next logic, this is what I used mostly when I come to pivot table, because this is where I have a pivot table design coming up here. Here I can just set the totals nicely, the subtotal, grand totals, and then how the report layout should showcase, whether it should come in a compact form or whether it has to come in a tabular data set. We can check them all clearly here. And we can do them all in this list. So this is what a pivot table is all about. In the pivot table anatomy, the pivot table alone is not a part, so we will be touching out on the pivot charts also. When I go for a pivot chart, I already said that it is a pivot table. It's a representation of your pivot table in a visualization for you. So normally when I go for a pivot table, I'm starting with a simple chart here called cluster column chart. Again, we have a hell a lot of varieties in the charts here. So when I showcase our pivot table, I will set them up, because in the current presentation I don't want to add a lot of slides here, so I want to make it a little lighter. So I'm just filling out with that here. We can do a lot more in a pivot chart here. Again, in a pivot chart, we have a pivot chart anatomy coming up here, and we'll have one more additional dimension here. Again, it starts with the pivot chart cache, and then you can see that the data is not anymore in a columnar style, it is in a row style here. And then when I jump back to the field list, the pivot chart field list, the names would have been renamed right now. Earlier we had filters, columns, rows and value in pivot table. In pivot chart will become filters, legend, series, axis, categories and value. A column is renamed as legend, my row is renamed as axis here. And then when I come back to the chart, again the window will be different. Again I have 3 floating menus. When I place my cursor in the pivot cache of a pivot chart cache, and then you can see that the chart analysis will come into play, design and formatting. Again the pivot chart analysis and pivot field analysis or pivot table field analysis will look kind of a similar one. We won't see something different. Again we will see more information like OLAP tools, and then we can even create a relationship if we are adding a data model using a pivot table here. So we will touch all those dimensions when we come back to Power Query and Power Pivot. We can see a filter connection can be established here. That's a different dimension altogether. Again there is subtle variances compared to the one which we saw a while ago. And this is the most used functionality here. Again in chart we have one more additional excellency that we have is we can swap a row and column in a chart field, so that the data will also change when a chart is built here. And this cannot be done in a pivot table, this can be done in a chart beautifully. And then you can color the charts, you can add a layout to the charts, you can change the chart type, and you can select the data that you want to add, and then you can move the chart to multiple sheets. Again when I come back to interactive dashboard of pivot table, I will be using a move chart option to keep the connectivity of the pivot table and chart intact. I still move the chart to another sheet without using the cut copy paste option. I never use this data, but I wish to use it. Again I'm trying this, and I think that I am talking about this particular window for quite a while right now. I'm talking about for almost half a decade now, where I said that I'll be using this sooner or later, but I don't think that I'm using it anywhere here. I'm seeing a different dimension altogether, so let's see how this is gonna pan out. Again in the near future I may be using this also. The final logic of our pivot table and pivot table windows, we have a logic called a slicer. A slicer is a menu based filter, or I can call this as fancy filter. When I go for slicers, again the slicers will come in multiple dimensions. The first part is the moment I add a slicer, you will see a floating menu coming on top. So when I click the floating menu of the slicer, you will see all these dimensions. You can add multiple columns, you can set the height and width of slicers here, and then you can arrange the slicer, you can add colors to the slicers and so on and so forth. And then you can see the captions here. You can use it by even giving a right click if you wanted to, and the report connection can also be built here. The next one will be the styles that I mentioned a while ago, and then you can add a range, and then you can also use the column field here and the height and width of the slices according to your usage. Again, what is the outside wall of the slicer height you can set, what is the button of the height and width you can set them all here. This is what we do deal in pivot table chart slicer. The anatomy of pivot table and chart slicer will be like that. So let's go into a data build, and then we'll see how we're going to use this. I'm going to create a new sheet here, and then I'm going to call this as pivot table. Again, the moment I go to pivot table, I wish to bring the dimensions in 2 different points. So let me just call this as PT, because I'm going to name this a PT range, and then I'm going to move this and create another sheet here. I'm going to call this as PT table. You can either create a pivot table using a range based data, or you can create the pivot table using a table based data. So it's up to you how do you want to do it. So let me build a data first of all, and then we will see what I'm going to deal with it. So I'm going to add a date, and then I'm going to use the sales here. Again, adding a date, the first date I can fill it out, so I'm going to fill the first dates here, and then I want a data either continuously, or I can create a data in a split dimension. So I want every 15 days once until 30th of June. Here I can either use a formula, or I can use the fill series option to do so. Again, the fill series option, I generally use a keyboard shortcut called Alt EIS. That's going to pop up the data. If you want to use the fill keyboard shortcut like we do in our latest version, I'll say Alt HFIS. So that's going to give you the same logic again. Alt EAS is the easiest way of doing it. That's a keyboard shortcut. And then I'm going to move this data to a column, and then I'm going to keep the data by the days, but I'm going to convert the step value into 15. I want my stop value to be 30th of June of 25. The moment I do it, you can see it's creating a 15-day breakup in my data set here. So if you have a planned vision of doing something like this, you can do it, or else if you want all the dates to fill in here, you can do that also. Now I want to fill the next value, so I'm going to fill that next value. Normally I type this value regularly. One of my colleagues, or Praveen, who worked with me, will always say, why you're typing all this 12,500? I really don't know why I'm typing it. This number sticks to my brain and I enjoy it. Again, I'm going to use the fill series right now. Again, this time the fill series is going to be a little different, because I'm not going to just fill them until a specific dimension. So I'm going to just select the range here. Again, I'm using fill series a little differently here. So I'm going to use the same keyboard shortcut. And then I'm keeping it's automatic. The moment I choose the column here, the series understands that I'm going to fill the data in a column. So I no longer move the cursor point from row to column, and then it is giving you the type as a linear. And I'm going to do only one thing here. I want to add 1,250 rupees as each value, and then I gave the last cell for the system, so the system doesn't need a stop value here. The moment I enter it, it gives you the value until the last line. Again, the data is slowly but steadily incrementing. When I add a chart, it look really odd. So to make the chart look a little interesting, so I'm just changing some values below here, so that I will have a wibbly wobbly job or wibbly wobbly way of seeing a chart here. Now I got this list. This is my range. I'm going to use the same range, copy it and put them in the pivot table field list. I'll later on convert that into pivot. I'll convert that into a table. So let's create a pivot table here. So how a pivot table will work? Again, I gave you a golden rule. So now the first two line item of my golden rule sticks here. I have headings and I don't have a blank cell, row or a column here. So if I get a data like this, creating a pivot table will be a heaven. But unfortunately, when we collect data from our sales representative, or the data are given in a last moment, then the data set will really be weirdo like this. So if there is no sales here in the sales column, I am really okay with that, because in some situation we will not be closing a sale on a particular day. I'm okay with that. But if I have a sales but I don't have a date, then this is the mistake of my sales representative. He cannot do something like this. Again, I cannot create a report where I have a sale but I don't know how, I don't have the dates here. That's a pathetic thing to do it. If I'm the manager of the particular sales representative, then I'll make sure that he gives you this data at least as early as possible. But when I build this data, I don't have this as a list here. This is where I'm going to use one of the functionality which I told you a little earlier. So we are going to use one of the dimensions here, that is called go to special option. Again, go to special option has a lot of things in it. I'm using few of them here, not all of them here. So I'll go back to the data set here. Now I want to select this line. I want to add a 0 everywhere where there is a blank in it, so that will allow me to get the valuation correctly. I don't want a blank cell here. Sometimes my report might not give me exactly what I love to see in my pivot table report. So I preferably use everything as a number field here. To do this, I can either use a keyboard shortcut called F5, which will take me to my go to special option, or I can just come back to my menu home tab and then I'll say find and select, and then I'll go to special here. So go to special directly goes here, but when I give a F5, that goes to go to function here. I'll be pressing this data set here. Again, if I want to go back to the keyboard shortcut of this, I can just use Alt H FD and then I can choose yes. That's going to directly go to the go to special option here. It's a long keyboard shortcut. Again, all this keyboard shortcut will come for you in our YouTube channel when we are uploading this video, because I am making sure that everything is coming out in our list here. So now I'm going to select all my blanks alone. So I have a lot of things in the go to special option. You can see row differences, column differences, precedence, dependence, last cell, visible cells only, conditional formatting, data validation, current array, current region, objects, formulas, constant, notes. You have a lot in go to special. I'm using only 2 of them today, or I'm using one of them today. That's called blanks here. So I'm going to give an OK. That's going to select all my blanks. We all know that when the data sets are selected like this, when I add a value, I'll be having one active cell, the other things are correlated with them. So when I punch something, it will go in the white cell. But if I want to populate that to the other gray cell, I'll give control and enter. So now I got all my zeros here. Unfortunately, I cannot do that in this column, because if I add a 0 here, that's going to give a very odd data. Probably we talked about this in our date and time functionality. I will reiterate that again one more time. If you're going for a date database in Excel, so the first date of the Excel date is 1/1/1900. I cannot go anything below than that. And then when I end the data, and that's going to give you a huge years for me. When I try to add a 0 here, this is going to go for the 0. For example, if I'm copy pasting this in here, and then I want to see what will be the generic term. Now it is a date field here. So now I'm going to say, so when I place the cursor here, and then I'll convert this into a general field, it will become a number for me. And then when I convert this into a general field, it's going to give you a number for me. So now the numbers will come differently. So if I go for today's date, then that's going to give a different scenario altogether. So I'm going to find out what is a date, what is this in the general terminology. In today's date, the numbers will be 45,679. When I go for this, and then when I add maybe a 0 here, this is going to go one date below than this. So that means this is going to showcase you a date called 31/12, maybe 1899. Or it can show a real weirdo component like 0001/1900. Something like this it can show, because it's going to go for 0. Because as it cannot go to the 1899 for you, because that number will not be read. If I change this to, I may copy paste this below and then showcase what happens when I try to convert this into a general format. So it's not converting that into a general format for me at all. So it's not reading that as a text here. So I'm going to go back and select this data, and then I'll try to add the go to special option. So I'm going to use Alt HFTS. It's going to populate this data. I'm going to go for blank. I don't want to use an arrow mark to navigate here. I can give Alt K. That's going to jump to the blank for me. When I give an enter, that's going to select the data for me automatically here. Now if I add a 0 and then give a control enter, let's see what happens. As I told you, it says 0001/1900, and that's not what I want here. I cannot have a date, because I'm having sales related to this financial year, or maybe this period that I'm looking for. I cannot have a date which is almost 2025 years ago, which is not going to really help me to do it. To make sure that to work this a little better, I'm going to give an equals, and then I'm going to select the previous day, and then I'll give control enter. That's going to populate the current trend of date. Again, my dates are not right here, I know that. So if I want to highlight and keep this data intact, so I'm going to keep all this data selected, and then I color them so that I know that these are the data that I will be changing it sooner or later, because these dates are not given to me by my sales representative. So I'm going to make sure that I'm getting this data, and now we can see that my data is complete, and I can work around with the data to get my pivot table. So this is how a pivot table will work for me. So now what I want right now is I want to create a pivot table here. So I can either just place the cursor in any one of cell. I know that the data set are continuous here, so pivot table will automatically choose the data continuously. Again, if you have a break in between, please check a time or so for, or you can just remove the unwanted blank cells, which will make you to think better. For example, if I've deleted this, but I didn't move my cell upwards, if I try to create a pivot table right now, my pivot table will come only until the previous date, or you can see that the dates are selecting only until the top. Then I have to manually select this data. That's a real headache for me. So that's the only reason why we need to have continuous data. Now when I bring back the data and when I start giving the keyboard shortcut for us, now we can see that the data set selects completely. Whenever I create a pivot table, again I maintain certain thumb rules like I did in my conditional formatting. You can create a pivot table in the same sheet if you wanted to, but I would like to keep them like the Excel suggests me to do so. So normally Excel just you say that please create them in a brand new sheet. Normally when I do this, what happens is when the moment I give an OK there, now my system will add a sheet in front of my existing data set here. So this is a normal functionality that we will get in sheet insertion in Excel normally, because whenever I use a keyboard shortcut Shift F11 by placing the cursor in a specific sheet, it will always add a sheet in front of the active sheet. It will never add the sheet in the back of the active sheet. When I come back to the last fag end of our session, we'll talk about VBA there. In the VBA, I will tell you how we can change that, or I preferably use them in a different dimension altogether. So I'll show you that also. When I give an OK, now it's going to add a new sheet for me called sheet 3. The moment it added the sheet, it gives you everything that you are looking for. I told you we'll see 4 fields when we are working on pivot table cache, which is on the left, pivot table fields on the right. On top you can see pivot table analysis and design here. I'll be using few of them in our current scenario, but as we go forward we will learn more about it. I'm going to call this as PTR. So I'm going to create a pivot table using a range. So I'll check the box here. The moment I check the box here, it automatically adds a few more dimensions. Again, Excel have vastly improved this field. Earlier when I click this, if I am using the oldest version possible, normally my data will not give you the auto grouping automatically here. So this can be avoided right now. So let me just rebuild this data one more time, because I'm going to make a small change in my options and I'm going to show you how it's going to work. So I'm going to place this cursor. Before I do that, I'll go back to my file. I'll go to options. If I don't want to see the data here, where I don't want the auto grouping to happen automatically, then I can set the data in such a way that the auto grouping can be avoided if I wanted to. So it's up to me what I want to do with it. I can play everything. So for this, I will go back to the Excel option, and in the data set I have a line called disable automatic grouping in the date and time column in a pivot table. So if I check this box, it's going to bring the data in my old school methodology level, where it's not going to give you an auto group here. I'll do this for one instant because I'm showing the variances, how a older version of pivot table will give you a result for you, then what else you will do to make sure the data set comes into play, and the latest version does this for you automatically. So I'm going to check this box and give an OK, and then now I'm going to create a pivot table right now. So I'm going to go back to the insert tab, click the pivot table, and again you get a lot of information here because I've connected my Excel with my Power BI, and then I can bring the data into a data model. I can bring the data from an external data source, and then I can bring a table and range here. Now I'm bringing a range here, not the table. Now I'm going to give an OK. That's going to add a sheet in front of me, and then I'm going to rename this as PTR. And then the moment I check this box, it's not going to give an auto group anymore. So this is how the old school methodology of pivot table will display for me. I don't see the grouping here, so then I'll add the sales here. You can check the box again. When I check it, you can see automatically my dates are coming in the rows automatically at the bottom, and then you can see the sum of sales is coming up automatically here, and I got my pivot table coming beautifully. Now my sales representative gave all the data for me. So let me just make this a little bigger so you can see them all. Now this is the pivot table will come. I don't know why I am fighting with Microsoft from version 2007, because that is where I started using them completely here. So when I started using that as a list, again normally pivot table displays the data pathetically like this. So it always starts with the row label and sum of sales and above. So I don't want the row label. I want to call this as a date. If I want to do that, what I'll do is I'll go back to my design, and then I'll go to the report layout and change the data to show in tabular form. The moment I do that, that's going to change the date point here automatically. And I got all the dates here. And then now I want to rename this. If I wanted to, I can just give a right click here. I can go back to value field settings. So value field settings is a go-to functionality where I can do a lot more for this column. Why I'm going for value field settings is when I go for value field settings, any new data is updated from a PT range table, that will automatically have the format running properly throughout the dataset here. That's the only reason why I'm always using the value field settings in pivot table. Again, when I go back to the pivot table, you can rename them if you wanted to, but unfortunately you cannot do the same name. The moment I type the sales and give an enter, that's going to show already saying that the name already exists, because the source name is sales and the custom name is also sales. That's the only reason why it's not allowing you to do it. Again, computer is found by us, so we can cheat computer if you wanted to. So what I'll do is I'll place the cursor here, I'll give one space here, and when I give an OK, that's going to automatically change the headers for me to sales here. But before I do that, I want to make one more changes here. I want to make sure this all these numbers are coming in rupees here, not in any other dimension. So I'm going to go back to my number format below, and in the number formatting, the cells will automatically populate for you. I can either use currency, the data will come really very close to this data. If I use accounting, this will look a little more better. So when I give an OK, that's going to showcase the data. I'm going to give an OK, that's going to add my list nice and superbly. Now my sales representative gave all the numbers, and then I'm going to change the data set a little differently here. I'll go back to my PT range, and then I'm going to just make sure that the data sets are coming perfectly. So I'm going to add 15 maybe 1250 one more time here, and then I'm going to add another 1250 one more time here, and then I'm changing this date. This date is actually changed to 31/25, and then this date is changed here. Again, I'm going to add another 15 days here, and finally I'm going to add another 15 days plus here also. So now I've made all the changes. We no longer need any changes to be done in the existing data, so I'm going to clear this list here. So now I got all my data, and my pivot table will still be the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a right click here. The moment I refresh it, everything will automatically update. Now we can see that the data sets are changing nice and clearly here. The formatting, when I change the dates, I added one more new date at the bottom of my sheet. The formattings are still intact for me. So now why we are not going to use a range, and where we will use a range and where we will use a table. So for example, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to add 3 more dates, or maybe another 2 more months here. So I'm going to just add 3 more months, let's say. I'm going to Alt EIS, and then Alt C, tab, 15 days tab, and I want this until July, August and September. So I'm going to say 39/25, and that's adding the data set for me. And again, I'm going to add another set of list here. I can just select the data from the first top, and then I'll say Alt EIS, and then that selects the column automatically. I want to increment the number by 1050, and then I'm going to make the data a little differently here, so that way it works for me. So now I've added 3 more months of data with me. When I go for a range here, this is not going to change automatically, because last time when I gave a refresh, it really worked for me, because the data changes happened within the given range, not with the new range. So when I try to give a right click and refresh this data, this is not going to work for you. This is where we are going to change the data set here. So to do this, I'll go back and place the cursor here. I'll go to pivot table analysis above, and then I'll go to change data source and click it. The moment I do it, that's going to jump back to my PT range sheet, and then it will show you what is the range is in selection. Whatever newly added data is not in selection for my pivot table. So now I have to literally rechange this data one time, and then give an OK. By that way, my data will automatically update my pivot table here. Now if I want to see them on data set, again, now this is giving you a different dimension altogether. So I no longer want this in every data. I want them as a consolidated way of doing it. So how do I consolidate? This is in the old school methodology. On the rate date, I'll give a right click, and then I'll go to the group button here. So that's going to group my data in any one of the dimension, and this is going to happen automatically if you're using Office 2013 version and then above. If it is 2010 version, the grouping will be done by us. Now I want to add everything in the month and dates, so I'm going to add the dates here, and then I'm going to keep the months here. If you want to maintain other dimensions also, you can do so. I'm going to give an OK. That's going to group the data completely, and you can see a different set of group comes into play. This I'm doing it manually. Again, this will come automatically when we are working in the latest version, and I've made sure that there is one option. I've enabled it so that grouping is not happening automatically. Now I'm interested only in the months, not in other dimensions. I'm going to remove the dates out of the equation. I got all the months, and again, when I do this, I'll have one more the weird object will come into play. I'll get the date is converted into months. That's what it's saying here. So I'm going to give a right click here. I'll go back to the field settings here, and then I'll rename this into months here. I won't call, I don't keep that list. Again, now the source name is months and date. My custom name is months, so the system is not going to shout at me. I'm just going to give you the data, and now I got a summarized sale value for the list. I don't have a detailed value. I get the list that I want here. So this is how we will use the auto grouping option. Now I'll remove the auto grouping option so that when I create a pivot table on the table feature, it will be a little different here. So I'll go back to my file again. I'll go back to my options, and then in the data set, I'm going to just uncheck the disable automatic grouping here. So that will enable this sequence for me. So let me add one more dimension for us in this list. So let me just come back to this pivot table again in here. So, but again, when I do this, I'm not gonna keep this as a range. So I'm going to convert this into a table, Control T, and give an enter. That is converting into a table, and I'm going to call this as PT table. I cannot give an hyphen here because my table name will not take a special character here. So now I'm going to create a pivot table. Again, I'm going to call this as PTT. It's pivot table using a table feature here. So I'm going to place the cursor here, and I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut Alt NVT. Now the pivot table range will be different here. Earlier it will be showing that the sheet name and the range is from so and so cell references here. Now it won't show like that. It will show this as a table. I'm going to give an OK. That's going to add the list. Again, everything is similar here. Again, as I have enabled the date grouping here, the moment I click this, that's going to group the data set for me automatically. And then I'm going to add a sales here. I will remove the date and the days out of the equation, so that's going to give you the list automatically for me. But unfortunately, it is only giving me the same old report that I saw earlier. I'll go back to the design, report layout, and show in tabular form. I'll rename the headers to only months, and then I'll give a right click here. I'm going to go back to my value field settings. I will remove the sum of out of the data, and then I'll add a space after the sales. I'll go back to the number format and add accounting here, and then give an OK there. So the plus point of using a table based pivot table is, so when I go back to my range, I'm selecting this data because this is the one which I've added later on. I'm going to copy that. I'll go back to my pivot table fields. When I add them below, now we can see that it is going to just extend the table automatically. The coloring will come automatically for me for the newly added data. So this will allow me to do things better. So let me rename this as PTT. Now when I come down here, I'll give a right click and refresh it. That's going to automatically populate the data for me. Again, earlier I worked it in a little differently because I had all the raw data coming up here, and then I grouped it manually. Here the grouping is done by the system automatically, so I'm not really tearing my hair apart. I'm just removing whatever I want to add, or I'm just keeping what I want. I'm removing what I don't want here. So this is how we build our pivot table. This is what a pivot table is all about. Now when I go for a pivot table, I have one weird scenario that comes in play here, because now if I want to find out the top 3 selling month, again reading a number will be cumbersome, and then if this is going to go for years of data, then I am done and dusted here. This is where our pictorial representation of a data set will be a more useful one for me. So that's where I'm going to add our pivot chart here. Again, for adding a pivot chart is very easy. So I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut Alt F1, which will give you the pivot table for me automatically. Again, I cannot place the cursor somewhere else. I have to place the cursor in the pivot table, so that when I take the data, the system brings the source from the pivot table and gives you the data set for you. I'm going to give an Alt F1. Here we go. You can see a pivot table coming up automatically. Now I exactly know the September month is the topmost month. The next month is May. And you can even find out the data set. Again, if you add the numbers above, it will be better. Again, it is like our pivot table. It's not going to give you all the data that you're looking forward for. It's going to give you a very odd data set out for us. So again, I'm going to make some changes here. So I'll remove all the unwanted fields. I'll select this total. I don't want this. And then I'm going to select the behind the scenes here. I'll delete that also. and you can rename the header if you wanted to. Again, if you're using a normal pivot table, renaming will be more easier for you. So now I want this as a monthly sales. So I'm going to type a header for this called monthly sales, or I'll even make it even more interesting here. So monthly sales turnover, and then I want this to come as a header here. I can manually type here. I have the facility to do so, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to keep this data set in such a way that it's not dotted, it is a continuous line. If the data selection is done and then it is continuous line, I'll go back to my formula bar above. I'll give an equals, and then I'll select this monthly sales and give an enter. That's going to give you the name automatically. So adding a header will be easier. If I don't want the turnover to come into play, I want to say monthly sales alone, then I can remove this on the cell reference above. That's going to showcase the data below. So that way it will be making our life a little better. So this is how we can use it. Again, if I want, again, I'm seeing the bars here nicely, but I am not able to see the bars with a number in it. If it is a number in it, it will be even more better. I don't want to see them on every time on the table here. I can see them on the chart itself. So to do that, I'm going to click the chart, and you will see a plus button coming up here. When I click the plus button, I'm going to use the fourth option called data label. The moment I do that, it's going to add here. But when I go for a data label, now if I try to add 3 more months of the data, the numbering might cluster or overlap on the one on the other one. I don't want the 16,250, 65,030, 58,750 and so on and so forth. If that's reduced to a lesser number, or if it looks like a annual reporting of a company, then that will make my life a little more easier. I'm going to remove all these additional zeros that I have in my axis here, which will reduce the zeros here. That's going to make this as a decimal numbers, or it'll say the numbers are decimal shown in thousands, the numbers are shown millions, billions and trillions and so on and so forth. Again, it's a EUS product. It is not going to define the currency in the Indian formatting part for us. So we talked about lakhs and crores here, but they will talk about billions and trillions here. So I'm going to go back to my left hand side axis. I'll give a right click there. I'll go back to format axis. The moment I do it, you can see the format axis coming up on the right hand side here. Here I'll go back to the display unit. Now at the moment there is none. I'm going to convert this into thousands here. The moment I do it, the extra zeros are gone, and you can see that the amounts are mentioned in thousands, and all my zeros are gone, and I can see the data come nice and clearly here. And if I can add 3 more months of the data, I don't think this is going to overlap with on one another. Maybe it might look a little congested, but you can use that nicely. But when I add 12 months of data, I will expand my chart here. So what I'll do is I'll just drag and drop the chart. Normally when I add a chart, I would like to keep the chart aligned to my Excel sheet cells here. You can do that if you wanted to. To do this, this is another trick that we will say. This is a hack, I can call it as, because this will show the pivot table chart nicely. So I'll press the Alt button on the keyboard, and then I'll drag this to the bottom. Now you can see that it is automatically going to the right line here, and then when I drag it to the right, it goes to the correct cell. It's jumping to the exact cell width. It's not going half a way through or in between here. So you can, something like this, you can do it. I pressed the Alt button here, and then I used the edges of the chart, and then I dragged it out using the mouse option here. Again, when you're doing it, press the Alt button continuously until you finish dragging them and setting them up according to the corners of your sheets here. So this is how we can add a chart here. And if I want to make this chart better, so let me just drag that to the top. You can see that once I've added it, when I drag it, the width and height is perfect. So I'm gonna align the top line, the bottom line will be automatically aligned here. So now I'll talk about the last and the final logic of our pivot table, that is called slices here. To add a slicer, I can either place the cursor in my pivot table or in a pivot chart. So wherever I go, I'll get this, because when I place the cursor in the pivot chart, when you go to pivot chart analysis, you will see insert slicer. When I go for the pivot table here, when I go to the pivot table analysis, you will see insert slicer here. I'm going to click the insert slicer here, then I'm going to add the months and then give an OK. That's going to give you all the months for me automatically here. But when I go for this, the real headache that I'll face in here is this data is going to give you all the 12 months for you, and then it's going to give you some weird answers at the bottom here. Sometimes this will be really very odd to see. If you're using 2016 version and above, this can be eradicated, or this can be removed from our slices. Earlier versions, it will always there. In the latest version, we can use that betterly. So for this, I'm going to give a right click in the slicer. I'll go to slicer setting below. Then it gives you a pop-up here. In the pop-up, I'm going to say hide the item where there is no data in it, because I have data only until September here. I don't want October, November, December, or the other 2 dates which is giving at the bottom. So I'm going to check this box and give an OK. That's going to remove that entire list here. And then I'm going to show this in 2 different columns. I did 2 columns here, or maybe I'll make it as 3 columns, so that will become nice and clearly here. So all the data sets are coming nicely, and you can add a color to it so that it will display the data nicely. And I'm choosing the right colors here. So whatever the chart that I'm using here, the chart color and the slicer color, if I try to mix and match it, so when I see a lot of charts, a lot of slices, I can correlate the slicer with the chart correctly. Now I can either choose one of them, or I can choose them diagonally, or I can choose them with multiple dimensions here. It filters out all our data beautifully. And if you don't want to see all of them, so you can, if you want to see all of them again, you can slash it out. You can see the list here. If I'm playing around with the date and time functionality, I have one more dimension that comes into play, is called insert timeline. Again, insert timeline works only on the date, so it's not going to work in any other dimension. The insert thing will come into play. Again, you can see that it is giving you the entire list for you, so you can make it as big as possible. And then you can see, again, I have a data here for the month of this list. So it says the data comes from June here. Okay, again, now I can see the entire year, because earlier it doesn't show me the whole year. So now I'm going to clear this. That's going to show the full year for me. So you can set the timeline here. Timeline will look like a little nicely. Again, it's more than a slicer again, but timeline works only on the date front. It won't work in other dimension, but slicers works everywhere possible. Again, if I reduce this, I don't think that I can make this as a multiple boxes here. Let me just make it bigger. It's going to be lengthier. It cannot be shorter here. So whenever you're working on the date field, always make sure that we are expanding it to the biggest space possible by us. And the advantage that is, if I have the data set, I can convert this into quarterly. I can convert this into days. It's going to give you 31 days for you. And I'm going to go for the year. It's going to give you only 1 year. If you have multiple data set, you can always work around with it. So now my data will be even more better. So I can, if I'm showing them all in quarters, then that will be nice here. So it's going to be smaller. It's not going to be larger. So I'll select quarter 1. That's going to filter out the quarter 1 for me. Now I'm not using the quarters anywhere. I can show quarter 2. That's going to show the quarter 2 for me, and I have quarter 3 until the data I have it. I can see them all. When I don't want it, I can clear that. So that's going to showcase the data in another dimension here. So you can set something like this, so that this is a timeline for you, and this is the slicer that I've used here. You can perform the same logic even in your current data set. Again, I've done that in our range. It's not going to do anything very big here. So again, you can perform this in our PTT file also. You can add a chart, rename the chart here, and then make sure the chart represents and shows things nicely. You can add a slicer. You can also add a timeline for the dates, and you can set the timelines accordingly. I have just made sure the data looks a little better for me, so I just used the timeline here for a code here. Again, it is automatically connected with my slicer and charts and tables here. The moment I touch this, everything changes here. And the slicer is not connected, but I'm connecting the data set on the charts and the table for me automatically. So this is how we can work with pivot table and chart and slices. And today we touched the logic of pivot table, charts and slices. Again, I've planned this today, and I think that I've completed it. We have another 6 minutes to go. I don't want to start this because I need a good 20 minutes to build an interactive dashboard effectively here. So with this, I will sign out our session today, and then we will catch up day after tomorrow. Not tomorrow, because tomorrow I'm not available. I'm going for training, and you guys can learn this. I'll upload this tonight. Probably tomorrow morning you will get this particular class in my YouTube channel, both in iSelf Academy Snippet and Excel Snippet YouTube channel. This is Vinod signing out, guys. Have a great day ahead, and then keep learning and keep rocking. Thank you so much.